When people hear the phrase reserve currency, they often imagine stacks of dollar bills locked inside the vaults of central banks. But a reserve currency is much more than cash. It is trust made visible. Think about it this way. Imagine you're a merchant living hundreds of years ago. You're preparing a ship that will sail halfway around the world. The journey will take months. You'll trade with people who speak different languages, live under different laws, and have never met you before. How do you convince them to accept your payment? Not every coin will do. The coin has to be recognized. It has to be trusted. Most importantly, everyone has to believe that someone else will accept it tomorrow. That's what separates ordinary money from a reserve currency. A reserve currency doesn't dominate because governments declare it important. It dominates because millions of merchants, bankers, investors, and eventually entire nations decide they trust it more than the alternatives. That trust creates extraordinary advantages. International contracts begin using the currency. Governments store it in their reserves. Banks hold more of it. Commodities are priced in it. Trade becomes easier because everyone speaks the same financial language. But there is something history teaches over and over again. Trust is never permanent. Every dominant currency has followed remarkably similar stages. First comes economic success. A nation expands its trade. Its merchants reach new markets. Its military protects important trade routes. Its financial institutions become reliable. Gradually, other countries begin holding that nation's currency, not because they're forced to, because it makes business easier. Then comes the golden age. For years, sometimes for generations, the currency appears untouchable. People begin believing it will remain dominant forever. That belief is understandable. It has happened every single time. The merchants who traded with Spanish silver believed nothing could replace it. The bankers of Amsterdam believed no city would ever surpass their financial system. London's investors once viewed the British pound as the natural money of the world. Each generation believed its monetary order was permanent. Each generation eventually discovered it wasn't. Because reserve currencies don't disappear overnight, they slowly lose something far more valuable than gold. They lose confidence. Sometimes through war, sometimes through debt, sometimes because another nation quietly builds a stronger economy. The process is usually gradual, so gradual that most people don't notice it happening, until history suddenly looks different. The dollar itself is part of that same story. It wasn't the first global currency. It wasn't created in isolation. In many ways, it inherited a legacy built by the empires that came before it. And the first empire to build a truly global monetary system wasn't the United States or Britain. It was Spain, powered by a single silver coin that traveled farther than anyone had ever imagined. That coin crossed oceans, connected continents, and became so influential that centuries later, America would borrow not only its weight, but even its name. The first currency to truly connect the world wasn't printed on paper. It wasn't backed by a central bank, and it certainly wasn't issued by the United States. It was a silver coin, simple in appearance, extraordinary in influence. In 1497, Spain introduced a standardized silver coin known as the Real de a Ocho, or the Piece of Eight. At first glance, it looked like countless other coins circulating across Europe. But what happened over the next 2 centuries transformed it into something history had never seen before. Spain had discovered something almost every empire dreams of, an almost endless supply of precious metal. After the conquest of the Americas, enormous silver deposits were uncovered in places like Potosí in present-day Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico. The mines produced astonishing quantities of silver, allowing Spain to mint millions upon millions of identical coins. For the first time in history, merchants separated by entire oceans could recognize the same currency. That changed everything. Imagine you're a trader sailing from Europe to Asia in the 16th century. Your journey lasts months. You arrive in a port where nobody speaks your language. You know nothing about local laws, yet when you place a Spanish silver coin on the table, people immediately recognize it. They trust its weight. They trust its purity. Most importantly, they trust that someone else will gladly accept it tomorrow. That is exactly what happened. The Piece of Eight spread far beyond the borders of the Spanish Empire. It circulated through Europe, across the Ottoman Empire, into India, throughout Southeast Asia, across the Pacific, and deep inside China, where silver had become essential to the Ming Dynasty's tax system. Some of those coins still exist today. Many carry tiny stamped symbols known as chop marks. Each mark was added by merchants who tested the coin's silver content before accepting it in trade. Those small stamps tell an incredible story. Long before international banking, before wire transfers, before the internet, people on opposite sides of the world had already built a global monetary network based almost entirely on trust. The coin itself became a passport. It crossed cultures, languages, religion, and empires. But every great financial system comes with a hidden cost. Behind Spain's immense wealth stood the brutal reality of silver extraction. According to the transcript, the mines of Potosí alone produced an estimated 60% of the world's silver during the second half of the 16th century. Much of that silver was extracted through forced labor under the Mita system, where indigenous workers and enslaved Africans endured horrific conditions underground. Thousands never returned. The prosperity of one empire was built upon the suffering of countless lives. History rarely remembers that side of economic success, yet it's often inseparable from it. Perhaps the most remarkable legacy of the Spanish dollar wasn't that it dominated world trade. It was that its influence survived the empire itself. When the newly independent United States needed a national currency, its founders didn't invent an entirely new standard. Instead, Alexander Hamilton studied circulating Spanish dollars. The Coinage Act of 1792 established the American dollar using nearly the same silver standard as the famous Piece of Eight. Even the name dollar traces its lineage through this monetary tradition. In other words, the world's most powerful currency was born by inheriting the credibility of one that came before it. But Spain's dominance would not last forever. Its silver continued flowing across the oceans. Its empire continued expanding, yet quietly. Another nation was discovering that controlling money required something even more valuable than precious metal. It required a financial system. Spain mastered silver. The Dutch mastered something far more powerful. They discovered how to make trust itself become money, and in doing so, they quietly reinvented global finance. Spain had something almost no other empire could match: silver. Ships loaded with treasure crossed the Atlantic year after year. At first, it seemed impossible that any rival could challenge such overwhelming wealth. Yet history often rewards innovation more than abundance. While Spain was shipping precious metal across oceans, a much smaller nation was quietly reinventing the way money itself worked. The Dutch Republic looked like an unlikely candidate to dominate global finance. It had no vast empire stretching across continents. No legendary silver mine, no enormous population. Much of its land had been reclaimed from the sea. By every traditional measure of power, the Dutch should have remained a minor European state. Instead, they became the financial center of the world. Their greatest resource wasn't gold. It wasn't silver. It was trust. By the early 17th century, Amsterdam had become one of Europe's busiest trading ports. Merchants arrived carrying coins from every corner of the known world. Spanish reals, German thalers, French écus, Venetian ducats. Each coin had a different weight, a different purity, a different value. Conducting international business became painfully complicated. Every major transaction began with the same question: can I trust this coin? The Dutch answered that question with one of history's greatest financial innovations. In 1609, Amsterdam established the Bank of Amsterdam, known as the Wissel Bank. Its idea was astonishingly simple. Instead of forcing merchants to inspect every coin they received, the bank examined each deposit, measured its actual metal content, and credited the owner with a standardized balance inside the bank. From that moment forward, large payments no longer required chests full of silver. They could be settled with nothing more than entries in a ledger. Today, that sounds ordinary. 400 years ago, it was revolutionary. For perhaps the first time in history, trust no longer depended entirely on the coin in your hand. It depended on the institution standing behind the transaction. Money was beginning to evolve, not from metal, but from credibility. Merchants quickly embraced the new system. Business became faster, safesh, more predictable. The bank guilder earned such a strong reputation that traders across Europe began treating it as one of the continent's most reliable monetary standards. Even Adam Smith later praised the system for the confidence it created in commercial exchange. But the Dutch weren't finished transforming global finance. Only a few years earlier, in 1602, they had created another institution that would change capitalism forever: the Dutch East India Company, better known as the VOC. Unlike earlier trading ventures, the VOC allowed thousands of ordinary investors to buy shares in a single enterprise. Those shares could then be traded openly. For the first time, people weren't simply buying goods. They were buying ownership. An entirely new financial market was born. What began as a way to finance overseas trade gradually evolved into the world's first modern stock market. The combination proved extraordinarily powerful. A trusted banking system, a liquid investment market, a global trading network. Together, they transformed Amsterdam into the financial capital of the 17th century. At its height, the VOC became one of the most valuable companies in history, exercising powers that resembled those of an empire. It maintained its own military forces, signed treaties, and governed overseas territories while operating as a commercial enterprise. The lesson was profound. Spain had shown that precious metals could build a global currency. The Dutch proved that strong financial institutions could be even more valuable. Because silver can be mined, trust cannot. Yet history has a habit of repeating itself. Every financial innovation eventually spreads. Every advantage invites competition. The same ideas that made Amsterdam rich would eventually be copied, improved, and carried across the English Channel. There, another island nation was preparing to build the greatest financial empire the world had ever seen. The Dutch taught the world how to trust institutions. The British would teach the world how to build an entire global economy around one currency, and for more than a century, that currency would be the pound sterling. By the 18th century, the center of global finance was beginning to move once again. The Dutch had transformed banking. They had pioneered stock markets. They had shown the world that institutions could create trust more effectively than precious metals alone. But financial innovation has one unavoidable consequence. Once others understand it, they begin copying it. No country copied the Dutch model more successfully than Britain. At first, there was nothing inevitable about Britain's rise. It was a relatively small island nation on the edge of Europe. Yet, over the next century, Britain quietly assembled something no empire before it had ever possessed. Not just military strength, not just commercial success, but an entire financial ecosystem. Everything revolved around one currency, the British pound sterling. Unlike Spain, Britain wasn't powered by endless silver mines. Instead, it built confidence through institutions. In 1816, Britain formally adopted the gold standard, fixing the value of the pound to a specific quantity of gold. Any Bank of England note could, in theory, be exchanged for gold at a fixed rate. That promise changed everything. Gold represented certainty. If merchants accepted pounds in India, Africa, South America, or North America, they knew exactly what those pounds were worth. For international trade, predictability was almost as valuable as the goods themselves. But gold alone wasn't enough. Many countries possessed gold. Very few possessed London. During the 19th century, the city of London became the financial capital of the world. Insurance companies protected ships crossing dangerous oceans. Banks financed railways stretching across continents. Commodity exchanges set prices for goods traded thousands of miles away. Investors from every corner of the globe sent their money to London because no other financial center offered the same combination of stability, liquidity, and legal certainty. This created a powerful cycle. The more people trusted the pound, the more they used it. The more they used it, the more valuable that trust became. Soon, governments themselves joined the system. Central banks began holding sterling in their reserves. International loans were issued in pounds. Major commodities were priced in pounds. Shipping contracts were written in pounds. If you wanted to participate in global commerce, you spoke the financial language of the British Empire. At its height, Britain's influence reached nearly a quarter of the world's land and population. Colonies traded through the sterling zone, reinforcing the pound's role as the world's dominant reserve currency. Yet Britain's greatest advantage wasn't simply the size of its empire. It was something much harder to build: reputation. For decades, investors believed that London was the safest place on earth to store capital. Governments trusted British institutions. Merchants trusted British contracts. Bankers trusted British markets. The pound became more than a currency. It became an institution in its own right. Some historians even argued that holding sterling was, in many situations, more practical than holding physical gold itself. Gold sat quietly inside vaults. Sterling generated returns through London's sophisticated financial markets. It was an extraordinary achievement. Britain had accomplished something no previous empire had fully managed. It convinced the world that confidence in its institutions was as valuable as confidence in precious metal. For nearly a century, the system appeared almost indestructible. Generations grew up believing the pound would remain the world's money forever. History, however, has little patience for permanence. The very system that made Britain powerful depended on peace, stable trade, and disciplined government finances. Then, in the summer of 1914, a handful of gunshots in a distant European city shattered all three. The British Empire didn't lose its monetary dominance because another currency suddenly became better. It lost it because one war forced the entire financial system to abandon the rules that had made sterling trusted in the first place. For more than a century, the British pound had seemed untouchable. Merchants trusted it. Governments held it. Banks relied on it. The global economy revolved around London. Then, almost overnight, everything changed. In the summer of 1914, a political crisis in Europe exploded into the First World War. Most people expected the fighting to end within months. Instead, it became one of the most destructive conflicts in human history. And it wasn't only armies that were exhausted. Financial systems were too. Wars on that scale cost unimaginable amounts of money. Governments needed weapons, ships, food, railroads, factories. Millions of soldiers had to be armed, transported, and supplied every single day. No treasury had enough gold to pay for all of it. So governments made a decision that would have been almost unthinkable only a few years earlier. They abandoned the very monetary system that had made international finance so stable. One after another, major European powers suspended the gold standard. Britain did the same. For generations, the promise had been simple. A pound could be exchanged for gold. Now, that promise disappeared. The world's most trusted currency had lost the rule that gave it credibility. To finance the war, governments borrowed on an unprecedented scale. They printed money, issued bonds, accumulated debts unlike anything seen before. When the fighting finally ended in 1918, victory came at a staggering financial cost. Britain emerged on the winning side of the war. Economically, it no longer resembled the country that had entered it. Before the conflict, Britain had been the world's largest creditor. By the end of the war, it had become one of its largest debtors. The transformation was extraordinary. Money that had once flowed into London now began flowing elsewhere, across the Atlantic, to the United States. While Europe was consumed by war, America had supplied food, steel, oil, machinery, and ammunition to the Allied powers. Those exports generated enormous wealth. Just as importantly, they transformed America's place in the global financial system. The United States no longer depended on foreign capital. Other countries increasingly depended on American capital. This shift accelerated after the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, giving the United States a modern central banking system just before the war reshaped the global economy. For the first time, the dollar wasn't simply America's currency. It was becoming an international one. Foreign governments needed dollars to purchase American goods. Banks began holding more dollar-denominated assets. Investors started viewing New York not merely as a growing financial center, but as a serious rival to London itself. Yet history rarely changes overnight. Despite Britain's weakened position, the pound did not immediately disappear from the global stage. Its reputation had been built over more than a century. Trust like that doesn't vanish in a single crisis. For several years, the world lived in an unusual situation. The old financial leader was weakening. The new one was still emerging. Two currencies, two financial centers, one increasingly unstable global economy. According to the transcript, many historians once believed the dollar only overtook sterling after the Second World War. But more recent research suggests the transition had already begun during the 1920s, with the two currencies sharing global reserve status far earlier than most people realize. It was no longer a question of whether global monetary leadership would change. The only question was how. Britain still believed it could restore the old order. America was quietly building the new one. The confrontation between those two visions would culminate in one decision that, with hindsight, proved disastrous. Britain decided to turn back the clock. It attempted to restore the pound to its former glory, as if the war had never happened. In 1925, one of Britain's most influential politicians made a decision he believed would save the pound. Instead, many historians now see it as one of the most expensive monetary mistakes of the 20th century. By the mid-1920s, Britain faced an uncomfortable reality. The war was over. But the world it had known before the war was gone. Its industries were weaker. Its debts were heavier. Its competitors were stronger. Yet many British leaders refused to accept that the old financial order had disappeared. Instead, they believed it could simply be restored. Among the strongest supporters of that idea was Winston Churchill, then serving as Chancellor of the Exchequer. In 1925, Britain made one of the most ambitious monetary decisions in its history. It returned the pound to the gold standard at its pre-war exchange rate. To many people, the announcement sounded reassuring. It suggested stability, discipline, a return to normal. It implied that Britain remained the financial leader the world had trusted for generations. But beneath the symbolism lay a serious problem. The Britain of 1925 was no longer the Britain of 1914. The economy had changed. The balance of global trade had changed. Even the distribution of wealth across the world had changed. Yet the exchange rate pretended none of those changes had happened. The pound was effectively priced as though the First World War had never taken place. That decision made British goods far more expensive on international markets. Imagine running a factory in Manchester. You produce high-quality textile, but suddenly, buyers overseas discover they can purchase similar products elsewhere for significantly less. Not because your workers became less skilled, not because your products became worse, simply because your currency had become too expensive. Exports weakened, factories struggled, orders declined. Employers began reducing wages and laying off workers. The stronger the pound appeared on paper, the harder life became for many British businesses. According to the transcript, the overvalued pound contributed to rising unemployment and deflation, placing enormous pressure on the British economy throughout the second half of the decade. Ironically, Britain was trying to restore confidence. Instead, it created economic strain. Meanwhile, another country was moving in the opposite direction. The United States wasn't trying to recreate the past. It was becoming the future. American factories were expanding. Its industrial output continued to grow. Its financial markets attracted increasing amounts of international capital. Foreign governments needed dollars to purchase American goods. Banks around the world began accumulating more dollar-denominated assets. The balance of financial power was shifting quietly, almost invisibly. Not because Britain suddenly collapsed, but because confidence gradually migrated toward a stronger economy. Recent scholarship cited in the transcript suggests that the dollar may have matched or even surpassed the pound's reserve status by the late 1920s, much earlier than many traditional accounts suggest. For a brief moment in history, the global monetary system rested on two competing pillars. London remained the world's most respected financial center. New York was becoming its fastest-growing rival. The arrangement looked stable. It wasn't. Two reserve currencies meant divided confidence. Two financial leaders meant competing priorities. The world had entered an uneasy transition, and then another crisis arrived, one that neither Britain nor America was prepared to handle. The Great Depression didn't simply destroy economies. It shattered the remaining balance between the pound and the dollar. When the Great Depression spread across the world, it wasn't only banks that failed. The international monetary system itself began falling apart. And in that collapse, the dollar found the opportunity that would change history forever. By the early 1940s, it had become painfully clear that the old monetary system was beyond repair. The Great Depression had shattered confidence. International trade had collapsed. Countries had devalued their currencies against one another. Tariffs had replaced cooperation. The financial order that had once connected the world had fallen apart. Then came another catastrophe, the Second World War. Once again, Europe became the battlefield. Factories were destroyed. Cities were bombed. Governments borrowed enormous sums simply to survive. Britain, which had once financed much of the world, now found itself fighting for its own economic future. Across the Atlantic, however, the situation looked very different. The United States had become the industrial engine of the Allied war effort. American factories supplied tanks, aircraft, food, fuel, machinery, and weapons on a scale no other nation could match. By the time victory seemed within reach, one reality had become impossible to ignore. The world's economic center had crossed the Atlantic, but winning the war was only half the challenge. The Allies also needed to prevent the financial chaos that had followed the First World War. They wanted a system that could stabilize exchange rates, encourage trade, and prevent another global depression. In July 1944, representatives from 44 nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. On the surface, it looked like an ordinary international conference. In reality, it was a negotiation over who would shape the financial future of the world. At the center of the discussion stood two remarkable men. One represented the old world, the other represented the new. John Maynard Keynes, Britain's most influential economist, arrived with an ambitious vision. He believed the post-war economy should not depend on the currency of any single nation. Instead, he proposed an entirely new international unit of account called the Bancor. The Bancor would belong to no country. It would be managed by an international institution, acting almost like a global central bank. In Keynes's view, this would prevent the dangerous imbalances that had destabilized the world economy during the interwar years. It was an elegant idea, perhaps even a visionary one, but economics is rarely separated from politics. Across the negotiating table sat Harry Dexter White, a senior official from the U.S. Treasury. White understood something Keynes could not change. Britain had brilliant ideas. America had the money. The United States had become the world's largest creditor. It possessed the strongest industrial economy. It held enormous gold reserves. Most importantly, other countries desperately needed American financial support to rebuild after the war. That reality gave Washington extraordinary leverage. White proposed a different system. Rather than creating an entirely new global currency, countries would fix their exchange rates to the US dollar, while the dollar itself remained convertible into gold at $35 per ounce. It was a simpler plan, and for the United States, a far more advantageous one. After weeks of negotiations, the balance of power became impossible to resist. Britain needed American loans. America did not need British approval. The agreement that emerged reflected that reality. The newly created International Monetary Fund, IMF, would help stabilize exchange rates. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, later part of the World Bank, would finance post-war reconstruction. And at the center of the entire system stood one currency, the United States dollar. It wasn't merely another reserve currency anymore. It had become the anchor of the international monetary order. For the first time in history, nearly every major currency would define its value through the dollar. The pound had not disappeared overnight, but its era as the unquestioned leader of global finance had ended. A new chapter had begun, one built not on imperial trade routes, but on American industry, American institutions, and American financial power. Yet history had one more surprise waiting. The dollar's new status depended on a promise that every dollar held abroad could still be exchanged for gold. For nearly 3 decades, the world believed that promise. Eventually, it became impossible to keep. The dollar had finally become the world's money. But less than 30 years later, the United States would break the very rule that gave the dollar its credibility in the first place. For nearly 3 decades after Bretton Woods, the system appeared remarkably successful. International trade expanded. Western Europe rebuilt. Japan experienced extraordinary economic growth. Businesses invested across borders with confidence. Stable exchange rates encouraged long-term planning. Many historians would later describe this period as one of the greatest economic expansions in modern history. At the center of it all stood a simple promise. Every dollar held by foreign governments could, in theory, be exchanged for gold at a fixed price of $35 per ounce. That promise made the dollar different. It wasn't just another paper currency. It was paper backed by something tangible. Or at least, the world believed it was, But hidden beneath that stability was a contradiction that grew larger every year. The global economy needed more dollars. Every new trading relationship, every international loan, every growing economy demanded additional dollar reserves. The problem was obvious. Once economists began looking closely, how could the United States supply more dollars to the rest of the world without eventually issuing more claims than it had gold to support? This became known as the Triffin dilemma. To provide liquidity for the world, America had to send dollars overseas. But the more dollars it exported, the harder it became to guarantee that every one of those dollars could still be exchanged for gold. For years, the contradiction remained hidden. Confidence was strong. Few governments questioned America's ability to honor its commitment. Then, during the 1960s, the pressure began to build. The United States dramatically increased spending. The Vietnam War demanded enormous financial resources. At the same time, ambitious domestic programs expanded federal expenditures. More dollars entered circulation. Inflation gradually accelerated. Meanwhile, foreign central banks accumulated growing piles of American currency. Some began asking an uncomfortable question. What if there were now more dollars than gold? One of the loudest critics was French President Charles de Gaulle. Rather than continuing to hold paper dollars, France increasingly chose to exchange them for physical gold, even sending ships to collect bullion from the United States. Other governments watched carefully. If enough countries demanded gold at the same time, America's reserves would quickly disappear. By 1971, the situation had become impossible to ignore. The United States faced a choice: continue exchanging dollars for gold and risk exhausting its reserve, or abandon the promise that had supported the Bretton Woods system since the end of World War II. On the evening of the 15th of August, 1971, President Richard Nixon addressed the nation. His announcement sounded temporary. It wasn't. He suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold. The world remembers this moment as the Nixon shock. With a single decision, the monetary system created at Bretton Woods effectively came to an end. For the first time in generations, the world's leading currency no longer rested on precious metal. It rested entirely on confidence. Many expected disaster. Without gold, critics argued, the dollar would surely lose its privileged position. History had other plans. The dollar weakened. Inflation surged during the 1970s. Gold prices climbed dramatically. Yet something unexpected happened. The dollar remained the world's preferred reserve currency, not because it was backed by gold, but because it was now backed by something history had gradually shown to be even more valuable: deep financial market, powerful institutions, an enormous economy, and the confidence that investors could still move billions of dollars through American markets more safely than anywhere else on Earth. The age of commodity-backed money had quietly ended. The age of institution-backed money had fully begun. The dollar had survived losing gold. But that raised an even bigger question. If gold no longer explained the dollar's dominance, what actually did? When President Nixon closed the gold window in 1971, many believed the dollar's reign had just begun to unravel. The logic seemed obvious. If dollars could no longer be exchanged for gold, why would the rest of the world continue trusting them? For a brief moment, it looked as though history might repeat itself. After all, every great reserve currency before the dollar had eventually lost its place. The Spanish silver dollar, the Dutch guilder, the British pound, each had once appeared untouchable. Each had eventually faded. So why didn't the dollar follow the same path? The answer wasn't gold. It was infrastructure. By the early 1970s, the dollar had become woven into almost every layer of the global economy. International trade was already conducted in dollars. Oil contracts were priced in dollars. Governments held enormous quantities of dollar reserves. Banks built their balance sheets around dollar-denominated assets. Replacing the dollar was no longer as simple as choosing another currency. The entire financial system had been built around it. Imagine replacing the foundation of a skyscraper after the building has already been completed. Technically, it might be possible. Practically, the risks are enormous. That was the dollar's greatest advantage. It had become more than money. It had become infrastructure. But another factor proved equally important. The United States offered something no other country could match: scale. Its economy remained the largest in the world. Its financial markets were deeper than any competitors. Most importantly, the market for U.S. Treasury securities became the safest and most liquid place for governments, pension funds, and central banks to store enormous amounts of capital. Liquidity matters. Imagine you're a central bank responsible for hundreds of billions of dollars. You need assets that can be bought or sold almost instantly without causing prices to collapse. Very few markets can absorb transactions of that size. The U.S. Treasury market can. That single advantage created an extraordinary level of confidence. When crises struck, money didn't run away from America. It usually ran toward it. Financial panic, regional wars, banking crises. Time after time, investors searched for safety in the same place. Dollar assets. This created a remarkable paradox. Even when the crisis began inside the United States, the dollar often became stronger because global investors trusted American financial markets more than the alternatives. That kind of confidence cannot be created overnight. It takes decades, perhaps generations. But confidence is only part of the story. No reserve currency rules forever, and in recent years, small signs of change have begun appearing. According to the transcript, the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has gradually declined over the past 2 decades. The euro remains the second largest reserve currency. The Chinese yuan is slowly expanding its international role. Meanwhile, central banks in countries including China, India, Russia, and several Gulf states have significantly increased their gold holdings, while exploring payment systems that rely less heavily on the dollar. The freezing of Russian central bank reserves in 2022 also prompted renewed debate about whether reserve currencies can become geopolitical tools. For many governments, a new question emerged. If access to reserve assets can be restricted, should every country rely so heavily on a single monetary system? These developments don't necessarily mean the dollar is about to lose its position. Far from it. The dollar still enjoys advantages no rival currently matches. But history teaches something important. Dominance rarely disappears all at once. It usually erodes quietly, long before most people realize the process has begun. And that brings us to the final lesson, hidden inside 5 centuries of monetary history. Every reserve currency in history was once considered permanent. Every one eventually proved otherwise. The dollar may be different. Or it may simply be the latest chapter in a story that has repeated itself for hundreds of years. If there's one pattern that appears again and again throughout monetary history, it's this. No reserve currency ever believed its reign would end. The Spanish Empire didn't. Its silver flooded every major trading route on Earth. For generations, merchants assumed the piece of 8 would remain the world's money forever. It didn't. The Dutch didn't believe their dominance would fade either. Amsterdam had created the world's most advanced financial system. The first modern bank, the first stock exchange, the first multinational corporation. It seemed impossible that anyone could overtake them. Someone did. Britain reached even greater heights. Its navy protected global trade. Its financial markets became the envy of the world. The pound sterling wasn't simply a currency. It became the language of international commerce. For more than a century, it appeared permanent. History proved otherwise. Then came the United States, an industrial giant, a financial superpower, the architect of Bretton Woods, the issuer of the world's reserve currency for nearly 8 decades. Today, the dollar remains at the center of international finance. According to the transcript, it still accounts for the largest share of global foreign exchange reserves and continues to dominate international trade, finance, and government reserves. Those are extraordinary advantages. But history reminds us that dominance and permanence are not the same thing. The merchants of 16th century Spain couldn't imagine a world without Spanish silver. The bankers of Amsterdam couldn't imagine finance leaving their city. Victorian Britain couldn't imagine London surrendering its place at the center of the global economy. Every generation believed it had reached the final chapter of monetary history. Every generation was mistaken. Perhaps that's because reserve currencies don't disappear in dramatic moments. They rarely collapse overnight. Instead, they slowly lose the qualities that made the world trust them in the first place. Debt accumulates, confidence weakens, new competitors emerge, technology changes, trade patterns evolve, institutions lose credibility. The process is gradual. So gradual that people living through it often mistake change for temporary disruption. Only decades later does history reveal that an entirely new era had already begun. The transcript points to several modern developments that have renewed debate about the future of the dollar. Its share of global reserves has slowly declined. Alternative payment systems are being developed. Some countries have increased their gold holdings while seeking to reduce dependence on the U.S. financial system. These changes do not necessarily mean the dollar is about to lose its position. History warns against simplistic prediction. Reserve currency transitions are measured in decades, sometimes generations. There is no obvious successor waiting to replace the dollar tomorrow. No single currency currently combines the depth, liquidity, institutional strength, and global acceptance that the dollar still enjoys. That is why the dollar continues to occupy a position no rival has yet been able to match. But perhaps that isn't the most important lesson. The real lesson is that monetary leadership is never inherited. It is earned, and it must be earned again, every single generation. Because a reserve currency is not backed only by gold, or military power, or economic size. It is backed by something far more fragile: trust. The moment the world begins looking elsewhere for that trust, history starts writing its next chapter, and by the time everyone notices, the transition may already be well underway. The story of the dollar isn't really about the dollar. It's about how civilizations build trust, how they lose it, and how financial power quietly moves from one nation to another over centuries. Understanding that history doesn't tell us exactly what will happen next, but it does remind us that no monetary system is guaranteed forever. So here's a question for you. If history has taught us that every reserve currency eventually gives way to another, do you think the US dollar will break the pattern, or is the world already witnessing the beginning of the next transition? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more deep dives into economic history, hidden financial systems, and the pivotal decisions that quietly shaped the modern world. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next documentary.